"Sir, step back. You're blocking traffic." The officer's voice was sharp, impatient, the kind of tone reserved for people society had already decided didn't matter. The elderly black man stood frozen at the edge of the sidewalk, his thin hands gripping a worn leather satchel like it was the only thing anchoring him to the world. His name was Henry Wallace, 74 years old, a retired school custodian who had lived in this neighborhood longer than the officers questioning him had been alive. "I'm telling you," Henry said again, his voice trembling but firm, "something bad is going to happen today. I've seen this before." The younger officer scoffed loudly, making sure everyone within earshot could hear. "You seen what, exactly?" he asked, dragging out the words. "A vision? A dream? Or are you just bored and looking for attention?" A few people nearby slowed their steps. Some stared. Others pretended not to look. Henry swallowed. His mouth was dry. "I heard them," he said quietly. "Last night, behind the old Franklin warehouse, they were talking about a delivery, about hurting people." The second officer, older, heavier, clearly tired, rubbed his temples. "Sir," he said, sighing, "we've had 3 false reports today already. We don't have time for this." Henry stepped forward without thinking. "Please," he said, urgency cracking through his voice now. "I wouldn't come here if it wasn't serious. I live right there." He pointed shakily toward the boarded-up buildings across the street. "I know what I heard." The younger officer immediately stepped into Henry's space. "Hey, I said step back." "I'm not causing trouble," Henry replied, startled. "I'm trying to prevent it." The officer laughed, not amused, not kind. "Prevent what?" He turned to his partner. "You hear this? He's trying to prevent something." A few snickers rippled from a small group nearby. Henry's face burned. Decades of swallowed pride pressed against his chest. "I worked for this city 40 years. I cleaned your police station floors. I raised my kids here. I'm not lying." The younger officer rolled his eyes. "Congratulations. That doesn't make you a detective." The older officer glanced at Henry again, something flickering behind his eyes. Doubt, maybe. Guilt. But it passed quickly. "Sir," he said, firmer now, "unless you have names, plates, weapons, or an actual crime in progress, there's nothing we can do." Henry's hands shook harder. "I don't know their names," he admitted, "but I know the sound of men planning harm. I've lived long enough to recognize it." The younger officer snorted. "You hear that?" He leaned closer to Henry, lowering his voice. "You're scaring people, and if you keep this up, I'll have to ask you to leave." Henry looked around. People were staring now. Some with curiosity, some with suspicion. One woman pulled her child closer. His warning, the thing that had kept him awake all night, was turning him into a spectacle. "I'm not crazy," Henry said, louder than he meant to. "I just don't want anyone to get hurt." The younger officer's patience snapped. "That's enough." He reached for Henry's arm, not roughly, but firmly enough to make a point. "You're done here." Henry flinched. "Please," he said, his voice breaking now. "Just check the warehouse. That's all I'm asking. Just look." The officer released him with a shove back toward the curb. "Move along, old man." The words landed heavier than a slap. Old man. Useless. Invisible. Henry stood there, chest heaving, humiliation flooding every inch of him. The older officer turned away first. "Dispatch, clear the call," he said to his radio. "False alarm." The radio crackled back. "Copy that." Just like that, it was over. The officers walked away, joking quietly between themselves. The crowd dispersed. Life resumed. Except Henry didn't move. He stood alone on the sidewalk, staring at the street that suddenly felt unfamiliar, like a place that had decided it no longer needed him. His knees ached, his heart pounded, and deep in his gut, the dread only grew heavier. "They won't listen," he whispered to himself, "but it's still going to happen." Across town, far from the sidewalk where Henry Wallace had been dismissed, A rusted metal door slid shut behind 3 men inside the Franklin warehouse. A crate was opened, a weapon was checked, and a clock quietly began counting down. By noon, the sidewalk where Henry Wallace had been dismissed looked exactly the same as it always did. Cars crawled past the intersection. A delivery truck idled at the curb. A pair of teenagers laughed as they crossed the street, earbuds in, music loud enough to drown out the world. Nothing looked dangerous. Nothing ever does, until it is. Henry shuffled home slowly, every step heavier than the last. His knees ached, not just from age, but from the way fear settles into the body when it has nowhere else to go. The leather satchel bumped against his hip, the strap worn thin from decades of use. Inside were old receipts, a Bible with loose pages, and a folded photograph of his late wife, Eleanor, smiling on the day they bought their first house. He paused halfway down the block and looked back toward the direction of the Franklin warehouse. The unease hadn't left him. If anything, it had sharpened. Henry had learned long ago that fear had different textures. There was panic, loud, chaotic, obvious, and then there was the kind sitting in his chest now, quiet, steady, patient, the kind that didn't scream but waited. He reached his small duplex just after noon. The door creaked open the same way it always had. Inside smelled faintly of dust and lemon cleaner. He set the satchel down carefully and lowered himself into the chair by the window, the one Eleanor used to read in before her hands started shaking too badly. Henry stared out at the street. The officer's words replayed in his mind, sharper each time. "You're wasting our time. False alarm. Move along, old man." He pressed his palm against his chest, trying to slow his breathing. "I did my part," he murmured, though the words didn't convince him. Across town, inside the precinct, the shift rolled on without interruption. Officer Tyler Brooks, the younger one, leaned back in his chair, boots kicked up on the edge of his desk as he scrolled through his phone. He chuckled at something on the screen. "You see this?" he asked, holding it up for his partner, Officer Ray Collins. "Guy calls in claiming aliens stole his mailbox." Ray snorted as he filled out paperwork. "Figures. Full moon tonight?" "Feels like it," Tyler replied. "Between that and the old man this morning, we're collecting weirdos." Ray paused, pen hovering just above the page. "The guy this morning," he said slowly, "he didn't feel crazy." Tyler rolled his eyes. "Come on, Collins, he didn't have anything. No names, no plates, no weapons, just vibes and fear." Ray leaned back in his chair. "Sometimes that's how it starts." Tyler smirked. "And sometimes it's just an old guy wanting attention." Ray didn't respond right away. He stared at the wall, jaw tightening slightly. He had grown up not far from the Franklin warehouse. He remembered when it had been a functioning factory, when men like Henry Wallace had clocked in every morning and come home with grease-stained hands and tired pride. He also remembered how things changed, how abandoned buildings became magnets for trouble. But the radio crackled before he could say anything more. "Unit 12, report of a disturbance on Maple and 6th. Ray grabbed his jacket. "Duty calls." By early afternoon, the city settled into its familiar rhythm. Shop owners swept sidewalks, school buses passed through neighborhoods. People argued about lunch orders and traffic and things that felt important in the moment. And behind the boarded-up windows of the Franklin warehouse, preparations continued. A man with a scar running down his cheek checked his watch. 2 hours, he said. Another man snapped a magazine into place with a metallic click that echoed against the concrete walls. "No delays," he replied. "We move on schedule." Outside, a delivery truck pulled into the alley behind the warehouse, right on time. No one noticed. No one ever did. Back at his duplex, Henry tried to distract himself. He brewed tea he didn't drink, turned on the television only to turn it off again, sat, stood, sat again. At 2:17 p.m., he picked up his phone. He stared at the police department's number, thumb hovering over the screen. "They already made it clear," he whispered. "They won't listen." He set the phone down. At 2:19 p.m., he picked it back up. This time, he dialed.
The line rang twice before a bored-sounding dispatcher answered. "Non-emergency line, how can I help you?" "Yes," Henry said, forcing calm into his voice. "This is Henry Wallace. I came in earlier today about—" A pause. "Sir, we already cleared that call." "I know," Henry said quickly. I feel worse about it now. Please, just send someone to look at the warehouse. I'm begging you." Another pause, longer this time. "Do you have new information?" the dispatcher asked. Henry's throat tightened. "No," he admitted, "just a bad feeling." The dispatcher sighed. "Sir, we can't dispatch units based on feelings." "I understand," Henry said quietly. "I just don't want anyone hurt." "I'm sorry," she replied, already disengaging. "We'll note your concern." The call ended. Henry stared at the dead screen. Note your concern. He felt something settle deep inside him, a cold resignation that tasted like guilt before anything had even happened. Across town, the radio scanner crackled again. This time, the tone was sharper, more urgent. "Possible suspicious activity reported near Franklin Warehouse." Ray's head snapped up. "Did you hear that?" he asked. Tyler frowned. "Probably another false alarm." Ray was already standing. "Let's go take a look." They arrived 20 minutes later. The warehouse sat quiet, silent, just as it always did. No movement, no noise, no sign of trouble. Ray circled the building once, eyes scanning the boarded doors, the rusted locks, the graffiti-splattered walls. "Looks dead," Tyler said. "Told you." Ray hesitated. Something about the stillness bothered him. Not peace, absence. "We should check the back alley," Ray said. Tyler groaned but followed. The alley was empty. The delivery truck was gone. Nothing to see. They returned to their cruiser. "See?" Tyler said. "We're good." Ray nodded, but unease followed him back into the car. At 4:03 p.m., Henry Wallace sat back down by his window. The sky had shifted. Clouds gathered low and heavy, pressing down on the neighborhood like a held breath. He pressed his palm to the glass. "I tried," he whispered, unsure who he was speaking to, Eleanor, God, or the part of himself that still believed warnings mattered. At 4:17 p.m., a loud bang echoed across town, then another, then screaming. Sirens began to rise, not one or two, but many, overlapping, colliding, filling the air with chaos. Henry's heart lurched. He stood up so fast his chair tipped backward. The sound was coming from the direction of the warehouse. "Oh no," he breathed. "Oh Lord, no." Miles away, radios exploded with frantic voices. "Shots fired near Franklin Warehouse. Multiple victims reported. All units respond immediately." Officer Ray Collins slammed the accelerator to the floor, his stomach dropping. Tyler's face had gone pale.
As they sped toward the chaos, Ray's mind replayed the image of an elderly man standing on a sidewalk, pleading to be heard. And for the first time that day, the words hit him like a blow. What if the old man was right? Sirens tore through the late afternoon air like ripping fabric. Henry Wallace stood frozen at his window, heart pounding so hard it hurt, watching red and blue lights streak past his street toward the Franklin warehouse. One car, two, then five, then more than he could count. His warning. They were finally going there, but not because they believed him, because it was already too late. Henry grabbed his satchel with trembling hands and rushed out the door, forgetting his coat, forgetting the ache in his knees. He didn't know what he thought he could do, only that sitting still felt unbearable. Every step down the sidewalk sent pain shooting up his legs, but he kept moving, leaning heavily on his cane. With each distant siren, guilt wrapped tighter around his chest. "I told them," he thought desperately. "I told them." Across town, the scene at the warehouse had exploded into chaos. Squad cars skidded into position, officers spilled out, weapons drawn, voices shouting commands that overlapped and tangled in the air. Smoke drifted from a shattered side window.
Somewhere inside, someone screamed, a raw, terrified sound that cut straight through the noise. Officer Ray Collins ducked behind a cruiser door as a loud crack echoed from inside the building. "Gunfire!" someone shouted. Ray's hands shook as he chambered around. This wasn't a false alarm. This wasn't nothing. Tyler crouched beside him, face pale, eyes wide. "Jesus," he muttered, "this is bad." Ray didn't answer. His mind was racing backward, replaying the morning over and over again. The way Henry Wallace's hands had trembled, not with confusion, but urgency. The way his eyes had stayed locked on the warehouse, like he could see something no one else wanted to. The way he hadn't asked for praise or reward, only that someone look. Ray swallowed hard. We didn't look. A command crackled over the radio. Suspects barricaded inside, possible hostages. Ray's stomach dropped. Hostages. That word echoed in his head, louder than the sirens. They advanced carefully, boots crunching over gravel and broken glass. The front door hung half open, splintered, the lock torn apart. Inside, the air smelled of oil, dust, and something metallic. Blood. Ray stepped in first, heart hammering. The warehouse interior was a maze of shadows, crates stacked like walls, old machinery loomed overhead. Somewhere deeper inside, voices echoed, harsh, panicked, angry. "Police!" Ray shouted. "Drop your weapons and come out with your hands up." A gunshot answered him. The officers scattered, taking cover. Ray pressed his back against a pillar, chest heaving. And then he saw it. Near the far wall, partially hidden behind a toppled crate, lay a familiar brown satchel. Henry's satchel. Ray's breath caught. "No," he whispered. "No, no, no." Before he could move, another officer shouted, "We've got civilians down." Ray sprinted toward the voice. Two people lay on the concrete floor, warehouse workers who'd been using the space for storage. One clutched his arm, blood soaking through his sleeve. The other was motionless, eyes staring blankly at the ceiling. Ray dropped to his knees, checking for a pulse. Nothing. The realization hit him like a physical blow. This didn't have to happen. Outside, Henry had made it halfway down Maple Street when the police blocked off the area. Yellow tape stretched across the road, officers shouting for people to move back. Henry tried to push forward. "Please," he said hoarsely, "I warned you. I need to—" An officer stopped him with an outstretched arm. "Sir, you need to step back. This is an active scene." Henry looked up into the young man's face, desperation flooding his own. "I know," he said. "That's why I'm here." Something in his voice made the officer hesitate. Ray emerged from the building just then, face drawn, eyes dark. He froze when he saw Henry standing there, cane clenched in his fist. Their eyes met. Recognition flashed across Ray's face, followed by something worse. Shame. Ray pushed past the tape. "Sir, you need to come with me," Ray said, voice tight. Henry blinked. "Am I under arrest?" he asked quietly. Ray shook his head. "No," he said. You're the reason we're here at all." Henry's shoulders sagged. "Too late," he whispered. Ray didn't argue. Inside the command vehicle, chaos reigned. Radios blared, officers shouted updates. A whiteboard filled with hastily scribbled notes listed names, times, injuries. Ray sat Henry down gently on a folding chair. "Tell me everything," Ray said. "From the beginning. Don't leave out a single detail." Henry closed his eyes for a moment, steadying himself. "I worked that warehouse for 37 years, he began. "I know its sounds, its rhythms. When something's wrong, the building tells you." He described the men he'd seen, the truck, the crates unloaded too carefully, the way they'd watch the street instead of their work. They weren't fixing anything, they were preparing. Ray listened, jaw tightening with every word. One of the senior officers stepped in, overhearing the last part. "You're saying you saw this morning?" Henry nodded. "Yes, sir, and I told your officers." The room went quiet. The officer looked at Ray. You spoke with him? Swallow. Yes, sir. And you dismissed it? Ray's face burned. Yes. Outside, a controlled explosion echoed as the tactical team breached a back section of the warehouse. Moments later, officers dragged 2 men out in cuffs, faces bruised, eyes wild. A third suspect followed, then a fourth. Weapons were laid out on the pavement, rifles, pistols, ammunition. And one crate, cracked open during the raid, revealed its contents. Stacks of stolen explosives, enough to level half the block. A murmur rippled through the officers. Henry stared at the crate, his chest tight. That's what I felt, he said softly, that weight in the air. Ray closed his eyes. You saved lives, he said, even if we didn't listen when we should have. Henry didn't shake his head. One man still died, and others were hurt. Ray had no answer. News vans arrived within minutes, cameras rolled, reporters spoke urgently into microphones, speculating wildly, and then someone asked the question that would spread like wildfire. How did police know to respond? An officer hesitated.
Another answered truthfully. We received a warning earlier today from a local resident, Henry Wallace. By evening, the city knew his name. By nightfall, the department knew its mistake, and for the first time since that morning, Henry Wallace felt something other than fear. He felt heard, but it came at a terrible cost, and the reckoning was only beginning. By nightfall, the city had split into 2 versions of the same story. On television screens, anchors spoke in urgent, clipped tones about a foiled warehouse plot, flashing images of police lights, yellow tape, and masked officers hauling suspects into vans. Graphics rolled across the bottom of the screen. Explosives seized, 1 fatality, investigation ongoing. But in living rooms, barber shops, diners, and church basements across the city, another story was taking shape, one that cut far deeper. An elderly black man warned police. They ignored him. Someone died. Henry Wallace sat alone in the small interview room at the precinct, his hands folded neatly in his lap, his cane resting against the wall. The room smelled faintly of stale coffee and disinfectant. A buzzing fluorescent light overhead flickered every few seconds, matching the dull throb behind his eyes. He hadn't been arrested, no one had raised their voice at him, but he also hadn't been allowed to go home. Not yet. Across the hall, voices rose and fell, tense, sharp, urgent. Phones rang endlessly. Footsteps hurried back and forth. Henry closed his eyes and tried to breathe. He thought of the man who had died on that warehouse floor, a name he didn't know, a family somewhere who would be getting a knock on the door tonight. Lord, he prayed silently, I tried. The door opened. Officer Ray Collins stepped inside, looking older than he had that morning. His uniform was rumpled, a dark stain on his sleeve where someone else's blood had soaked through. Mr. Wallace, Ray said quietly, they're asking questions upstairs. Command staff, internal affairs too. Henry nodded slowly. I expected that. Ray hesitated, then pulled out a chair and sat across from him. I owe you an apology, he said. Not the kind you hear in front of cameras, a real one. Henry studied the young man's face, the tight jaw, the tired eyes. Go on, Henry said gently. I didn't listen, admitted Ray. I saw your age before I saw your urgency. I heard your voice, but I didn't respect it, and because of that, people got hurt. Henry's throat tightened. You're not the first, he said, and you won't be the last. That's part of the problem. Ray swallowed hard. They're going to ask you to make a statement. The media already knows your name. Henry sighed. I didn't ask for that. I know, Ray replied, but it's happening anyway. As if on cue, a knock sounded. A sharply dressed woman stepped in, tablet tucked under her arm. Mr. Wallace, she said briskly, I'm Deputy Chief Karen Mitchell. I'd like to speak with you. Henry rose slowly, leaning on his cane.
Ray stood too, but Mitchell held up a hand. "Just him," she said. The walk down the hallway felt longer than it should have. Officers stopped talking as Henry passed. Some looked ashamed, others curious. A few looked defensive. Mitchell led him into a larger conference room. Several senior officers sat around a long table, their faces tight. A legal advisor sat in the corner, pen poised. Mitchell gestured to a chair. "Please," she said. Henry sat. She folded her hands. "Mr. Wallace, first, let me say this plainly. What happened today should not have unfolded the way it did." Henry said nothing. "You came forward with a concern. Our officers failed to act appropriately. That failure is under review." Henry lifted his gaze. "A man died. Is that under review too?" A heavy silence followed. Mitchell nodded once. "Yes," she said. "It is." One of the officers cleared his throat. "Mr. Wallace, can you explain why you believe the situation was dangerous?" Henry straightened. "I've lived near that warehouse for 42 years. I worked there most of my life. I know the difference between repairs and preparation. Those men weren't fixing anything." He described it all again, the truck, the crates, the way the men scanned the street. "And when I spoke to your officers, I wasn't asking for special treatment. I was asking for attention." Mitchell nodded slowly. "And when Officer Collins spoke with you," she said carefully, "did you feel dismissed?" Henry met her eyes. "Yes," he said simply. One of the men at the table shifted uncomfortably. Outside the precinct, the crowd was growing. By 9 p.m., reporters had set up lights. Protesters gathered across the street, holding handmade signs. "Listen to us. Age is not a crime. He warned you." A chant rose and fell, echoing down the block. Henry watched it all later in a small TV in the waiting area, his face illuminated by the flickering screen. Mrs. Thompson, his neighbor, appeared on the news. "I've known Henry for 20 years. He's not confused, he's careful, and they treated him like he didn't matter." Social media lit up with clips of Henry being escorted into the precinct, cropped, slowed, analyzed. Some comments praised him as a hero. Others were uglier. Why didn't he call earlier? Why didn't he insist harder? Why didn't he go to someone else? Henry turned the TV off. The guilt was already heavy enough. Later that night, Mitchell returned. "You're free to go home, but I need to ask something of you." Henry looked up, tired. "What is it?" "We'd like you to speak tomorrow, publicly, about what happened." Henry frowned. "You want me to fix this for you?" Mitchell didn't flinch. "No," she said. "We want the truth from you." Henry considered that. "Truth has consequences," he said. "I know," Mitchell replied. Henry stood slowly. "Then I'll speak," he said, "but not to protect you, to protect the next person you might ignore." Mitchell nodded. Outside, Ray waited by the door. "I'll walk you home," he said. As they stepped into the cool night air, the chants grew louder. Some people clapped when they saw Henry. Others reached out, touching his arm gently, like he was something fragile and strong at all once. Ray walked beside him in silence. "I used to think routine kept us safe. Now I think it just makes us blind." Henry nodded. "Routine is comfortable, but danger doesn't announce itself politely." They reached Henry's building. The familiar brick facade looked smaller somehow, worn by time. Henry paused before going inside. "You're a good man," he said to Ray, "but good intentions don't stop bad outcomes." Ray nodded, eyes shining. "I won't forget today," he said. "Make sure the department doesn't either," Henry replied.
Upstairs, Henry sat in his worn armchair, the day finally catching up to him. His knees ached, his head throbbed, his heart felt heavier than it had in years. Tomorrow, he would speak. Tomorrow, the city would listen. But tonight, he bowed his head and prayed, not for praise, not for revenge, only that the next warning wouldn't be ignored. Because the truth was finally out, and now it was going to demand answers. Morning didn't come gently. It arrived heavy, loud and impatient, sirens in the distance, helicopters chopping the air, news vans crowding the street outside Henry Wallace's apartment building like vultures circling truth. Henry sat at his small kitchen table, hands wrapped around a mug of coffee gone cold. He hadn't slept more than an hour. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw the warehouse floor again, the flash, the chaos, the body covered with a tarp. Being right didn't feel like victory. It felt like grief with witnesses. A knock sounded at his door, firm, respectful. Henry rose slowly, his knees protesting as they always did, and opened it to find Officer Ray Collins standing there, out of uniform. He wore a plain jacket, his badge clipped to his belt instead of his chest. "Morning, Mr. Wallace," Ray said softly. "I'm here to escort you. City Hall." Henry nodded. "Let me get my coat." The ride downtown passed in silence. Streets Henry had known for decades looked different now. Barricades, cameras, crowds. His city felt louder, sharper, less forgiving. When they arrived, the steps of City Hall were packed. Reporters called his name. "Mr. Wallace! Henry, over here! Do you feel vindicated?" Henry paused at the car door and turned slowly toward them. "I feel tired, and I feel sad. That's all." Inside, the building buzzed with tension. Lawyers, officials, aides moving quickly, whispering behind folders. Henry was led to a waiting room where Deputy Chief Karen Mitchell stood reviewing notes. She looked up when he entered. "Thank you for coming," she said. "I said I would. That still means something to me." Mitchell gestured to a chair. "They'll begin shortly. Before we go in, I want to be clear. You're not on trial here." Henry gave a small, humorless smile. "Feels like it anyway." Across the city, televisions flickered on, in nursing homes, in diners, in living rooms where retirees sat with coffee and quiet anger. Older Americans leaned forward in their chairs, watching a man who looked like their neighbor, or their father, or themselves. A man who had done what he was told all his life and was ignored anyway. The council chamber filled quickly. City officials lined one side, police leadership the other. The public gallery overflowed. Henry was sworn in. His hand trembled slightly on the Bible, not from fear, but from the weight of memory. "Mr. Wallace," the council chair began, "please tell us what happened the morning you contacted police." Henry cleared his throat. He told it calmly, carefully, without drama. He described the men, the truck, the crates, the urgency he felt in his bones. He described being told to go home, not once, but twice. "When you left the scene," the chair asked, "did you believe the danger had passed?" Henry shook his head. "No," he said. "I believed it had been handed off, or at least I hoped it had." A murmur rippled through the room. A councilwoman leaned forward. "Mr. Wallace, why do you think your warning wasn't taken seriously?" Henry didn't answer right away. He looked around the room at uniforms, suits, faces trained to control. Then he spoke. "Because I'm old, and because I'm black, and because when people like me speak urgently, it makes others uncomfortable." Silence fell like a held breath. "I've lived long enough to know when my voice is being heard and when it's being tolerated." Somewhere in the gallery, someone began to cry. The questioning continued for over an hour. Henry never raised his voice, never accused by name, never demanded punishment. He simply told the truth, and that truth landed harder than anger ever could. Outside, the fallout was already spreading. By noon, the mayor issued a statement promising a full investigation. By afternoon, Internal Affairs announced multiple officers had been placed on administrative leave, including the one who had dismissed Henry first. By evening, protest signs had multiplied. "Listen to elders. Respect is public safety." Morning didn't come gently. It arrived heavy, loud, and impatient. Sirens in the distance, helicopters chopping the air, news vans crowding the street outside Henry Wallace's apartment building like vultures circling truth. Henry sat at his small kitchen table, hands wrapped around a mug of coffee gone cold. He hadn't slept more than an hour. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw the warehouse floor again, the flash, the chaos, the body covered with a tarp. Being right didn't feel like victory. It felt like grief with witnesses. A knock sounded at his door, firm, respectful. Henry rose slowly, his knees protesting as they always did, and opened it to find Officer Ray Collins standing there, out of uniform. He wore a plain jacket, his badge clipped to his belt instead of his chest. "Morning, Mr. Wallace," Ray said softly. "I'm here to escort you. City Hall." Henry nodded. "Let me get my coat." The ride downtown passed in silence. Streets Henry had known for decades looked different now. Barricades, cameras, crowds. His city felt louder, sharper, less forgiving. When they arrived, the steps of City Hall were packed. Reporters called his name. "Mr. Wallace! Henry, over here! Do you feel vindicated?" Henry paused at the car door and turned slowly toward them. "I feel tired, and I feel sad. That's all." Inside, the building buzzed with tension. Lawyers, officials, aides moving quickly, whispering behind folders. Henry was led to a waiting room where Deputy Chief Karen Mitchell stood reviewing notes. She looked up when he entered. "Thank you for coming," she said. "I said I would. That still means something to me." Mitchell gestured to a chair. "They'll begin shortly. Before we go in, I want to be clear. You're not on trial here." Henry gave a small, humorless smile. "Feels like it anyway." Across the city, televisions flickered on, in nursing homes, in diners, in living rooms where retirees sat with coffee and quiet anger. Older Americans leaned forward in their chairs, watching a man who looked like their neighbor, or their father, or themselves. A man who had done what he was told all his life and was ignored anyway. The council chamber filled quickly. City officials lined one side, police leadership the other. The public gallery overflowed. Henry was sworn in. His hand trembled slightly on the Bible, not from fear, but from the weight of memory. "Mr. Wallace," the council chair began, "please tell us what happened the morning you contacted police." Henry cleared his throat. He told it calmly, carefully, without drama. He described the men, the truck, the crates, the urgency he felt in his bones. He described being told to go home, not once, but twice. "When you left the scene," the chair asked, "did you believe the danger had passed?" Henry shook his head.
"No," he said. "I believed it had been handed off, or at least I hoped it had." A murmur rippled through the room. A councilwoman leaned forward. "Mr. Wallace," she asked, "why do you think your warning wasn't taken seriously?" Henry didn't answer right away. He looked around the room, at uniforms, suits, faces trained to control. Then he spoke. "Because I'm old," he said, "and because I'm black, and because when people like me speak urgently, it makes others uncomfortable." Silence fell like a held breath. "I've lived long enough," Henry continued, "to know when my voice is being heard and when it's being tolerated." Somewhere in the gallery, someone began to cry. The questioning continued for over an hour. Henry never raised his voice, never accused by name, never demanded punishment. He simply told the truth. And that truth landed harder than anger ever could. Outside, the fallout was already spreading. By noon, the mayor issued a statement promising a full investigation. By afternoon, Internal Affairs announced multiple officers had been placed on administrative leave, including the one who had dismissed Henry first. By evening, protest signs had multiplied. "Listen to elders. Respect is public safety. He warned you." At the precinct, morale cracked. Officers argued quietly in hallways. Some defended protocol. Others stared at the floor, haunted. Ray sat alone in the locker room, scrolling through footage of the hearing on his phone. He watched Henry speak, steady, dignified, unbreakable, and he felt something shift inside him. At Henry's apartment, neighbors knocked throughout the day. Some brought food, some brought hugs, some brought apologies for things they'd never said but now understood. Mrs. Thompson squeezed his hand. "They finally listened," she said. Henry nodded. "Yes," he replied, "but it shouldn't have taken blood." That night, Henry sat in his armchair again, the room lit by a single lamp. His cane rested nearby. The TV murmured softly in the background. A news anchor spoke words Henry never expected to hear. Public opinion has turned sharply in favor of Henry Wallace, whose warning may have saved countless lives had it been heeded sooner. Henry turned the TV off. He didn't want praise. He wanted peace. But peace was not coming yet. His phone rang. Unknown number. He answered cautiously. "Mr. Wallace?" a woman said, voice tight. "This is Sarah Klein. My brother was the officer who died at the warehouse." Henry's heart dropped. "I'm so sorry," he immediately said. There was a pause. "I just wanted you to know," she continued, "that I don't blame you. He believed in doing the right thing, and he would have wanted your voice heard." Tears filled Henry's eyes. "Thank you," he whispered. "That means more than you know." After the call, Henry sat in silence for a long time. Being right cost lives. Being ignored cost trust. And now the city stood at a crossroads, whether to change or simply move on until the next warning came. Henry closed his eyes. Tomorrow, the investigations would deepen. Tomorrow, names would surface. Tomorrow, accountability would be tested. And Henry Wallace, the man they once dismissed, would remain exactly what he had always been: a witness, a warning, and a reminder that wisdom does not grow louder with age. It grows easier to ignore until it's too late. The city didn't sleep that night. Sirens echoed through neighborhoods long after midnight. Not emergencies, just presence. Police cruisers idled on corners they'd ignored for years. News helicopters hovered low, their lights sweeping across rooftops like uneasy conscience. Henry Wallace sat awake in his apartment, the TV off, the world pressing in anyway. Being right had turned him into something dangerous, not a hero, a mirror. Across town, inside the police headquarters, the mood was brittle. Conversations stopped when doors opened. Officers checked phones compulsively, watching public opinion tilt like a scale no one had calibrated for. Deputy Chief Karen Mitchell stood at the front of the command room, arms crossed, jaw tight. "We are not here to protect reputations," she said. "We are here to protect the truth." A lieutenant shifted uncomfortably. "With respect, ma'am, morale is collapsing." "Morale collapses when trust does," Mitchell snapped back, "and trust collapsed when we stopped listening." Internal affairs officers began calling names. Not loudly, not dramatically, just one by one. The officer who'd waved Henry away that first morning was escorted out of the building under silent stares, no handcuffs, no shouting, just the heavy sound of boots on tile. Word spread fast. Outside the department, protesters gathered again, but this time the crowd was different. Older faces dominated. Veterans, retired teachers, grandmothers leaning on walkers, men with caps embroidered with military units long disbanded, people who knew what it meant to be dismissed politely. They held signs that didn't scream, they accused. "We warned you too. Age is not ignorance. Listen or bleed." Inside his apartment, Henry watched none of it.
He sat at his small desk, an old photograph in his hands, him and his late wife, Ruth, smiling in front of a church decades ago. She would have hated this attention, he murmured. A knock came at the door. Henry stiffened, then rose slowly. It was Ray Collins again, this time with no badge, no authority, just a man standing uncertainly. "I shouldn't be here," Ray said quietly. "Off duty." Henry studied him for a moment, then stepped aside. "Sit," he said. They did. Silence filled the room before Ray finally spoke. "I replayed that morning 100 times, every second, every choice." Henry nodded. "That's the curse of hindsight. It convinces us we would have done better." Ray swallowed. "I should have trusted you." "Yes," Henry said gently, "you should have." The simplicity of it cut deeper than anger. Ray looked up. "I'm not asking forgiveness." "Good," Henry replied. "It's earned." Ray managed a weak smile. "I resigned, not because they told me to, because I couldn't keep wearing the uniform knowing I failed the reason I put it on." Henry studied him carefully. "That matters. Not enough, but it matters." Ray stood to leave, pausing at the door. "They're talking about policy changes, mandatory follow-ups, elder priority response, training." Henry nodded. "Policies don't change hearts, but they slow harm. That's a start." When Ray left, he felt the weight settle again. This wasn't over. By morning, the backlash sharpened. Talk radio hosts argued over whether Henry had been over-dramatic. Social media dissected his past. Old photos, old statements, harmless things twisted sharp. Some called him brave, others called him lucky. A few called him dangerous. Henry didn't read any of it, but his niece did, and she showed up furious. "They're trying to discredit you, like you're the problem." Henry smiled tiredly. "They always look for comfort. Truth doesn't give it." At City Hall, pressure mounted. Union leaders pushed back against disciplinary actions. The mayor's office released careful language, heavy on sympathy, light on accountability. And through it all, one question echoed. Why didn't they listen? The answer came during a leaked internal memo. It wasn't dramatic, just procedural. Henry's call was marked low priority, elderly complainant. These phrases spread like wildfire. Elderly, complainant, not witness, not citizen, not warning. The outrage exploded. Senior centers erupted in town halls. Veterans groups demanded hearings. Churches rang bells in protest. And Henry Wallace's phone rang non-stop. He answered none of it. Instead, he returned to the place that had started everything, the warehouse district. Police tape still fluttered in the wind. The air smelled faintly of smoke and old fear. Henry stood at the edge, leaning on his cane. A young officer approached hesitantly. "Sir, you shouldn't be here alone," he said. Henry looked at him calmly. "I was alone when it mattered." The officer swallowed, unsure what to say. Henry turned away, staring at the boarded-up entrance. "I didn't want to be right," he said softly. Behind him, cameras clicked. But Henry didn't turn, because this wasn't about spectacle. It was about reckoning. And reckoning never arrives quietly. As night fell, the city braced itself for lawsuits, for reforms, for anger, for change, or the illusion of it. Henry walked home slowly, each step deliberate. Tomorrow there would be more questions, more blame,
More noise, but one truth had already taken root. Ignoring wisdom has consequences, and this time, the city could no longer pretend it didn't hear the warning. The hearing room smelled like old paper, cheap coffee, and nerves. Every seat was filled, not with activists or politicians, but with people who had lived long enough to recognize patterns, men and women with gray hair and steady eyes,
people who remembered being dismissed with smiles and silence. Henry Wallace sat in the front row, hands folded over his cane, posture straight despite the weight of the moment. He hadn't wanted to come. He'd said his piece already. But the city insisted, not because they valued him, but because they feared what ignoring him again would cost. Cameras lined the back wall. Red lights blinked on. And for the first time, the story was no longer being told about Henry. It was being told by him. The council chair cleared his throat. "Mr. Wallace, thank you for appearing today." Henry nodded once. "I didn't come for thanks." A ripple moved through the room. "You reported suspicious activity multiple times prior to the incident," the chair continued. "Can you explain what you saw?" Henry leaned forward slightly. "I saw men unloading equipment they didn't want seen," he said evenly. "I saw license plates covered. I saw doors guarded at hours when no business should have been open." He paused. "And I saw officers look past me like I was furniture." A murmur followed. One council member leaned in. "Did you feel dismissed because of your age?" Henry didn't hesitate. "Yes." "Because of your race?" Henry met her eyes. "Yes." The word landed heavy. No dramatics, no anger, just truth. Across the room, Deputy Chief Mitchell watched closely. She'd read the reports. She knew what had been marked low priority. She knew whose signatures were on those decisions. And she knew the damage couldn't be undone, only acknowledged. "Mr. Wallace," another council member asked, "what would have changed the outcome?" Henry thought for a moment. "Belief," he said. "Not in me, in the idea that experience still matters." Silence followed. Outside the building, a crowd waited, not chanting, not shouting, listening. The hearing stretched on for hours. Emails were read aloud, dispatch logs projected on screens, policy language dissected, and slowly, painfully, a pattern emerged. Warnings from elderly residents were consistently deprioritized, not maliciously, they claimed, just procedurally. Efficiency, risk assessment, but procedure had nearly killed people. By the time Henry was dismissed, the room felt altered, like something irreversible had happened. As he stood to leave, a young woman approached him, early 30s, city employee badge clipped to her jacket. "My grandfather called in something similar last year," she said quietly. Nothing happened. Henry placed a hand over hers. "Then today matters." The story broke wider that evening. Not just Henry's. Dozens came forward. An older mechanic who'd reported stolen chemical drums, an older nurse who'd warned about a dangerous caregiver, a veteran who'd flagged suspicious deliveries near a school. All ignored, all logged, all quietly dismissed. The narrative shifted. This wasn't a single mistake. It was a system trained to tune out voices that didn't shout. National media descended. Panels debated elder credibility. Think pieces argued whether wisdom had been replaced by data. And in the middle of it all sat Henry Wallace, who wanted none of it. He spent most days walking his neighborhood, nodding to people who now recognized him. Some thanked him, some apologized, some just looked ashamed. One afternoon, Henry stopped at the corner store where the clerk, a teenager, stared at him wide-eyed. "You're the guy," the boy said. Henry smiled faintly. "I'm just a guy." "No, you're the reason my grandma called the police again." Henry's chest tightened. "That's a good reason." Behind closed doors, the backlash intensified. The police union pushed hard. Anonymous threats appeared online. Someone spray-painted "snitch" on Henry's building door. It was cleaned by morning, but the message lingered. Ray Collins returned one evening, concern etched deep. "They're pushing back," Ray warned. "Hard." Henry poured tea calmly. "They always do when power shifts." Ray hesitated. "You should consider staying with family for a while." Henry shook his head. "No," he said. This is where I belong. That night, Henry sat at his desk again, but this time he wrote, not a speech, a letter, to the city, to the next generation. He wrote about listening, about patterns repeating when memory fades, about how danger rarely announces itself loudly. It whispers to those willing to hear. He didn't know if anyone would read it, but he knew silence was no longer an option. Days later, the letter was published. It went viral for reasons no algorithm could explain. Not anger, not blame. Clarity. People shared it with captions like, "This is what we ignore. Read this before it's too late." The mayor finally requested a private meeting. Henry declined. "Too late for that," he said through his niece. Instead, reforms were announced publicly. Mandatory response reviews, civilian oversight panels with elder representation, training modules that included listening, not just compliance. Were they enough? Henry didn't know, but he knew something had shifted. One evening, as he returned home, a patrol car slowed beside him. A young officer rolled down the window. "Mr. Wallace, just wanted to say, we're listening now." Henry studied him. "Good," he replied, "because warnings don't come twice." The officer nodded solemnly and drove on. Henry climbed the steps to his apartment, tired but steady. The city buzzed around him, louder, more cautious, more aware. He looked up at the sky, darkening into evening. Ruth would have liked this, he thought. Not the attention, the impact. But even as change took root, Henry knew one thing clearly. The reckoning wasn't finished, because listening once isn't the same as remembering, and memory is the hardest thing to protect.
The sirens cut through the early morning air like a blade. Not rushing, not panicked, measured, deliberate. Henry Wallace stood at his window as the police vehicles rolled past his building one by one, lights flashing against the brick walls he'd stared at for over 40 years. He didn't need to ask why they were there. He already knew. When you've lived long enough, patterns announce themselves before facts do. The city had listened, but now the city was afraid. Overnight, federal investigators had arrived, quietly, without press releases or speeches. They didn't come to shake hands or offer condolences. They came with boxes, warrants, and questions no one in power wanted to answer. By 8:17 a.m., 3 senior officers were escorted out of headquarters. By noon, 2 city contracts were frozen. By evening, the truth that Henry had tried to warn them about weeks earlier was no longer rumor, it was documented, time-stamped, undeniable. The abandoned warehouse he'd reported wasn't just suspicious, it was a staging site, a hub for stolen industrial chemicals rerouted through shell companies tied to city contractors, chemicals meant for infrastructure projects, quietly siphoned, resold, and stored illegally near residential blocks, near schools, near homes, near people who trusted the system to protect them. And the paper trail? It showed something worse than corruption. It showed indifference. Calls marked low priority based on the caller profile, age, neighborhood, prior complaints. Henry's warnings had been filtered through an algorithm designed to optimize resources. In plain language, the city had decided voices like his weren't worth urgency. When reporters finally arrived at Henry's building, he didn't come outside. He sat at his kitchen table, tea growing cold, listening to the noise he'd never wanted. His niece, Carla, paced nearby. "They're asking for you by name," she said. "They say this story doesn't exist without you." Henry exhaled slowly. "That's the problem," he replied. "It shouldn't take someone almost dying to be heard." The mayor resigned that afternoon. Not in disgrace, his statement claimed, but in recognition of systemic failure. Henry snorted softly when he heard that phrase on the radio. Failure didn't just happen, it was built, brick by brick, excuse
by excuse. That evening, Henry finally stepped outside. Cameras surged forward, but he raised one hand. They stopped. He walked slowly to the podium someone had set up without asking him. He didn't look at the reporters. He looked past them, at the people. "I'm not here because I want to be," he began. "I'm here because someone always has to stand where others won't." His voice was steady, old, unignorable. "I didn't predict anything," he continued. "I recognized it, because when you've watched the same mistakes repeat long enough, they stop looking random." A reporter shouted a question about race, another about age. Henry held up his hand again. "This isn't about who I am," he said. "It's about who wasn't listened to." He paused. "Today, it was me. Tomorrow, it'll be someone else. Unless you change how you listen." Silence spread. Not the awkward kind. The kind that meant people were thinking. "I don't want apologies. I want memory. I want the next officer who hears a trembling voice to stop and ask, 'What if they're right?'" He stepped back. No dramatic exit. No raised fist. Just truth, placed carefully where it could do the most damage. To complacency. Over the next weeks, changes came fast. Emergency response protocols rewritten. Community advisory boards formed, with elders at the center, not the margins. The algorithm was suspended indefinitely. And something unexpected happened. Calls from older residents increased. Not frivolous, careful, observant. Because once people realized they might be believed, they spoke. A fire hazard prevented. A trafficking route uncovered. A missing child found within hours because a grandmother noticed something off on her block. Henry watched all of it from a distance. He refused awards, declined interviews. He didn't want to be a symbol. He wanted to be a reminder. One quiet afternoon, Henry returned to the police station. Not as a witness, as a guest. Deputy Chief Mitchell met him at the door. "I wanted you to see this," she said, guiding him into a room. On the wall hung a plaque. Not with his name, but with words. "Listen first. Age is not irrelevance. Every warning deserves weight." Henry read it carefully, then nodded. "That'll do," he said. As he left, a young dispatcher caught his eye. She stood straighter, listened closer. Henry smiled faintly. Outside, the city moved on, as cities always do. But something underneath had shifted. A crack in the old assumptions. A reminder etched into policy and practice that wisdom doesn't retire, that warnings don't expire, and that sometimes the most dangerous mistake a system can make is deciding who's worth listening to. That night, Henry sat by his window again. Same chair, same view. But the silence felt different now. Less dismissive, more alert. He picked up his notebook, the one
he'd written his warnings in long before anyone cared, and closed it gently. He wouldn't need it anymore. Not because danger was gone, but because, finally, someone was listening.